The Jefferson County Courthouse stood like a white marble island in the center of Riverdale, its columns reaching toward the clear blue sky of a perfect May morning. For most locals, the building was simply part of the landscape, something they passed every day without a second thought. But for Abigail Wilson, standing at the base of its wide stone steps in mud-splattered boots and jeans that had seen better days, the courthouse might as well have been Mount Everest. "You can do this, Abby," she whispered to herself, clutching a manila folder filled with hastily assembled documents against her chest. "It's just a building, just people, just words." But they weren't just words. They were legal terms she'd spent the last 3 nights desperately trying to understand, highlighting passages in legal websites until her eyes burned. Foreclosure, lien, counterclaim, a foreign language she'd never expected to need. The Wilson family farm had been in her family for 4 generations. Ever since her parents died in the car accident 2 years ago, Abigail had poured everything into keeping it afloat. Her savings, her time, her heart. And now, after a devastating drought and equipment failures that seemed to multiply weekly, Western Bank was coming to take it all away. She couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't even afford a new pair of boots. So here she was, about to represent herself in court against a team of bank attorneys who probably spent more on coffee each morning than she made in a week. Abigail took a deep breath, straightened her simple blue blouse, and marched up the steps. The courtroom was exactly as intimidating as she'd feared, all polished wood, hushed voices, and people in expensive suits who looked like they belonged there. She slid into a seat in the back, scanning her folder one last time, whispering legal phrases under her breath. First time in court. Abigail looked up to find a woman about her age, in a tailored charcoal suit, offering a sympathetic smile. "Is it that obvious?" Abigail asked. "Only because you look exactly how I felt my first time," the woman replied, extending her hand. "Elena Rodriguez, Public Defender's Office. Abigail Wilson, no office." She managed a weak smile. "Just trying not to lose my family's farm." Elena glanced at the documents peeking from Abigail's folder. "Self-representing in a foreclosure case? That's ambitious." "It's desperate," Abigail corrected. "But I don't have much choice." Before Elena could respond, the bailiff's voice boomed through the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge James Harrington." The man who entered wore his authority like a tailored suit. Tall, with broad shoulders and a jawline that could have been carved from stone, Judge Harrington moved with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Dark hair, with just a touch of silver at the temples, piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. He couldn't have been more than 40, but already had the gravity of a much older man. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice deep and precise. As he organized the papers before him, he looked out over the courtroom with an expression of cool efficiency. "Let's move through today's docket expeditiously. First case, Western Bank versus Wilson." Abigail's heart slammed against her ribs as she stood on wobbly legs. Across the aisle, 3 attorneys in matching navy suits rose in unison, like a synchronized swimming team of legal sharks. "Thomas Reynolds representing Western Bank, Your Honor," the center shark announced, "with my colleagues John Davis and Sarah Miller." Judge Harrington nodded, then turned his gaze to Abigail. There was a moment, just a flicker, where something like surprise crossed his face. Perhaps he wasn't used to seeing someone in work boots and jeans in his courtroom. "And you are?" he asked, his tone making it clear he was unimpressed. "Abigail Wilson, Your Honor. I'm representing myself." Her voice came out higher and thinner than she'd intended. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to slightly pained. "Ms. Wilson, are you aware that you're facing foreclosure proceedings against a major financial institution?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you've chosen not to secure legal representation?" Abigail straightened her shoulders. "I've chosen to represent myself because I can't afford an attorney, Your Honor." A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrington silenced it with a glance. "Very well. Mr. Reynolds, you may present your case." What followed was 20 minutes of legal terminology that made Abigail's research sessions seem like kindergarten lessons. The bank's lead attorney spoke confidently about defaulted payments, breach of contract, and statutory compliance. He presented a stack of exhibits with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. When it was finally her turn, Abigail approached the podium with her folder clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Ms. Wilson, you may present your defense," Judge Harrington said, checking his watch with undisguised impatience. "Thank you, Your Honor." She pulled out her papers with trembling fingers. I believe the bank has not properly accounted for the payments I made in February and March. I have receipts here that—" "Are these receipts properly entered as exhibits?" The judge interrupted. I'm not sure what that means, Your Honor." Judge Harrington sighed audibly. "Ms. Wilson, this court operates according to established rules of procedure. You can't simply wave papers around and expect the court to consider them evidence." "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Clearly, the word cut like a knife. "What else do you have?" Abigail fumbled with her notes. "The loan agreement includes provisions for hardship extensions following natural disasters, and last summer's drought was declared a state emergency, which I believe qualifies." "Citation," Judge Harrington interrupted again. "Excuse me? Which specific clause in your loan agreement are you referring to? And have you filed the appropriate hardship extension paperwork with the bank prior to this proceeding?" Abigail's face burned. I don't have the exact clause number, and I tried to discuss hardship options with my bank representative, but— "So you have no documentation of formal hardship claims filed with the bank?" Not exactly, but—" Judge Harrington leaned forward. "Ms. Wilson, while I appreciate that you may be in a difficult financial situation, this court cannot simply ignore established legal procedures because you find them inconvenient. The law doesn't work that way." There was a titter of laughter from somewhere behind her, probably from the bank's legal team. Abigail felt her chest tighten as tears threatened to form in her eyes. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she managed, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm asking for a chance to save my family's legacy. That farm has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it with his bare hands. My parents died trying to keep it running. It's all I have left of them." For a moment something flickered in the judge's eyes, perhaps a hint of sympathy. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cool professionalism. "This court deals in legal facts, Ms. Wilson, not family sentiments. Do you have any actual legal defense to present?" The tears were dangerously close now. Abigail swallowed hard and shook her head. "No, Your Honor." "Then I'm afraid I have no choice but to rule in favor of the plaintiff. Western Bank has established clear grounds for foreclosure. The Wilson property will be auctioned according to standard procedure in 30 days. He banged his gavel with finality. "Next case." Abigail stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. 4 generations, 120 years of Wilson blood, sweat and tears, gone with the tap of a wooden hammer. She barely registered gathering her papers or walking out of the courtroom. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, trying to breathe through the tightness in her chest. Ms. Wilson, Eleanor, the public defender, appeared beside her. "I'm sorry about what happened in there." Abigail nodded numbly. "Is he always like that?" "Judge Harrington?" Elena's expression was grim. "They call him the Iceman around here. Brilliant legal mind, but not exactly known for his bedside manner. He made me feel about 2 inches tall." "Yeah, he has that effect on people." Elena hesitated. "Look, I know it's probably too late for your case, but I have a friend who specializes in property law. He sometimes takes on pro bono cases. I could give him a call?" "Thank you, but I don't think it would help." Abigail straightened, squaring her shoulders with the resilience that had kept her going through 2 years of struggle. "Apparently I didn't file the right paperwork or cite the right clause. The law's the law, right?" Elena looked like she wanted to say more, but just then the courthouse doors opened, and Judge Harrington himself strode out, engaged in conversation with an older man in an expensive suit. Abigail froze as they passed, but the judge didn't even glance her way. "James, you have to see the property," the older man was saying. 1,400 acres of prime riverfront land, just waiting for development. Once we clear out the existing structures, we could break ground by fall. "I told you, Richard, I can't discuss potential investments that might come before my court," the judge replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "But now that you've ruled on the Wilson foreclosure, there's no conflict of interest," the man, Richard, persisted. "Harrington Luxury Developments could transform that backward little farm into the most exclusive residential community in the county. Think about it, Riverside Estates by Harrington. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" They moved out of earshot. But Abigail had heard enough. Her shock transformed instantly into white-hot anger. "Did you hear that?" she hissed to Elena. "He's going to buy my farm and turn it into luxury houses?" Elena looked uncomfortable. It's not exactly a secret that Judge Harrington comes from money. His family has been in real estate development for generations. But he couldn't legally rule on your case if he had a direct interest in the outcome. He just did. Abigail's voice rose enough that several people turned to stare. She lowered it to an intense whisper. "He humiliated me in there, rushed through my case, and now he's planning to profit from it. That would be highly unethical, but what? You heard him. No conflict of interest now that he's ruled against me." Abigail's mind raced. "There has to be something I can do, some way to appeal or report him or something." Eleanor hesitated. "Appeals are complicated and expensive, and making accusations against a judge without solid evidence is not advisable." Abigail felt defeat settling over her again like a heavy blanket. What could she do? She was just a farmer with no money, no legal knowledge, and now no home. "I should go," she said finally. "I have animals to feed, while they're still mine anyway." She was halfway down the courthouse steps when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Is this Abigail Wilson?" An unfamiliar male voice, formal and professional. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Michael Thornton, from the law firm of Thornton, Beck and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Eleanor Sutton. Would you be available to meet with me this afternoon?" Abigail frowned. "Who? I don't know any Margaret Sutton. She was your maternal grandmother's cousin, Miss Wilson, and according to our records, you're her sole surviving heir." The world seemed to tilt slightly under Abigail's feet. What? "Her heir, Miss Wilson, to Sutton Ranch, all 1,400 acres of it." 1,400 acres. The same number the judge's friend had mentioned. It couldn't be. "I think there's been a mistake," Abigail said carefully. "My mother never mentioned any wealthy relatives." "There's no mistake, Miss Wilson. Margaret Sutton passed away 3 weeks ago at the age of 94. She had no children of her own, and your mother was her closest living relative. With your mother's passing, that makes you next in line. According to Mrs. Sutton's will, you inherit everything: the land, the house, and a rather substantial trust fund that's been accumulating interest for several decades." Abigail sat down hard on the courthouse steps. "I don't understand. Why am I just hearing about this now?" "Mrs. Sutton was a private individual. She and your grandmother had a falling out many years ago, before your mother was even born. Family estrangement, I'm afraid. Mrs. Sutton kept track of the family from a distance, but never reconnected. Her will was quite clear, however. Everything goes to you." Abigail's mind spun with the implications. A ranch, money, a future that suddenly wasn't being auctioned off to the highest bidder. And somewhere in the courthouse behind her, Judge James Harrington was making plans for property he didn't know she now owned. "Mr. Thornton," she said slowly, a plan beginning to form, "I'd very much like to meet with you today. As soon as possible, actually." As she hung up the phone, Abigail looked back at the courthouse, a small, determined smile forming on her lips. Judge Harrington had humiliated her, dismissed her, and planned to profit from her loss. He had no idea what was coming. The offices of Thornton, Beck and Associates occupied the entire top floor of the tallest building in Riverdale, which, at 6 stories, wasn't saying much. Still, as Abigail stepped out of the elevator into a reception area of gleaming hardwood and soft leather furniture, she felt even more out of place than she had in the courthouse. At least she'd had time to go home and change. The blue dress she wore was simple and a few years out of style, but it was the best thing she owned, saved for special occasions that rarely came. She'd pulled her chestnut hair into a neat ponytail and even applied a touch of mascara and lip gloss, small efforts to look like someone who might plausibly inherit a fortune. Miss Wilson, the receptionist, a poised woman with a sleek bob, smiled warmly. "Mr. Thornton is expecting you. Right this way, please." Abigail followed her down a hallway lined with landscape paintings of the surrounding countryside, rolling hills, forests, and the wide, lazy curve of the Jefferson River. At the end of the hall, the receptionist knocked on a heavy wooden door. "Come in," Og called a voice from inside. Michael Thornton rose from behind an imposing desk as they entered. He was older than Abigail had expected, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He extended his hand with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "Ms. Wilson, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat." He gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee, tea, water?" "Water would be nice, thank you," Abigail said, her throat suddenly dry. As the receptionist left to fetch it, Thornton settled back into his chair. "I imagine you have quite a few questions." "About 1,000,000, Abigail admitted. "Starting with, who exactly was Margaret Sutton, and why have I never heard of her?" Thornton nodded, reaching for a thick folder on his desk. "A fair question. Margaret Sutton was your grandmother Elizabeth's first cousin. They were quite close as children from what I understand, but had a significant falling out in their early 20s, over a man, as these things often are." "A man?" "Yes. Margaret and Elizabeth apparently fell in love with the same young rancher, your grandfather, as it turned out. When he chose Elizabeth, Margaret was, well, devastated would be putting it mildly." The receptionist returned with Abigail's water, and she took a grateful sip. "So my grandmother stole her cousin's boyfriend, and that led to a lifetime estrangement?" Abigail asked when they were alone again. Thornton's expression turned thoughtful. People often underestimate the depth of youthful emotions, especially first love. Margaret never married, never had children. She poured all her passion into building Sutton Ranch, into one of the most successful agricultural operations in the state. He opened the folder and turned it toward Abigail. Inside were photographs, aerial views of an enormous property stretching along what appeared to be the Jefferson River, with lush pastures, orchards, and a beautiful white farmhouse nestled among mature oak trees. "This is Sutton Ranch, 1,400 acres of prime agricultural land, including 3 miles of riverfront property." Thornton's finger traced the boundaries in one photo. "It's currently leased to various farming operations, bringing in substantial annual revenue. The main house has been meticulously maintained, though Margaret hadn't lived there for the past 5 years. She moved to a smaller property in Arizona for health reasons." Abigail stared at the photos, unable to reconcile them with her reality. "And she left all of this to me, someone she never even met?" "Family was important to Margaret, despite the estrangement. She kept tabs on your grandmother over the years and later on, your mother and you. She knew about your parents' accident. She knew you were trying to save the Wilson farm." Thornton paused. "I believe she admired your determination. If she admired it so much, why didn't she help before now?" "Before I lost everything?" The words came out sharper than Abigail intended. Thornton didn't seem offended. "Pride is a powerful force, Ms. Wilson. Margaret had it in abundance. She wanted to reach out many times over the years, but could never quite bring herself to do it. The past held her prisoner in that way." He shuffled through some papers. However, she made provisions for you in her will long before your current difficulties. He slid a document toward her. This is a summary of your inheritance. The ranch itself, valued at approximately $22 million. A portfolio of investments worth roughly $8 million, and liquid assets, cash essentially, of just over $3 million. Abigail's water glass froze halfway to her lips. That's $33 million. Give or take, Thornton agreed mildly, as though discussing the weather. There are some tax implications, of course, but we've structured things to minimize those as much as legally possible. The room seemed to tilt again, just as it had on the courthouse steps. Abigail set down her glass carefully before she could drop it. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now. This is a lot to process. Thornton leaned back in his chair. There is one stipulation in the will I should mention, however. Of course, there was a catch. There was always a catch. What kind of stipulation? In order to inherit the full estate, you must maintain ownership of Sutton Ranch for a minimum of 1 year. You can't sell it, subdivide it, or develop it during that time. Margaret was quite adamant about this point. She wanted you to give ranch life a genuine chance before making any permanent decisions about the property. Abigail thought about the developer she'd overheard talking to Judge Harrington, and if someone wanted to buy it right now, they'd have to wait. Thornton smiled. Believe me, there are many who would love to get their hands on that land. We've already received inquiries, despite keeping the change in ownership as quiet as possible. A plan was crystallizing in Abigail's mind, a chance not just to save herself, but perhaps to teach a certain arrogant judge a lesson in humility. Mr. Thornton, when exactly do I take ownership? Immediately. The paperwork has already been filed. The keys to the property are yours today if you want them. He reached into a drawer and produced a set of keys attached to a silver horse-shaped keychain. I can have someone drive you out to see the place this afternoon if you'd like. Abigail took the keys, feeling their weight in her palm, the weight of possibility, of revenge, of a future suddenly wide open. That would be wonderful. But first I have a question about something else. She set the keys on the desk and leaned forward. The Wilson farm, my farm, is being foreclosed on. The ruling just came down this morning. Is there any way to stop that process now? Thornton looked thoughtful. With your new financial situation, certainly. We could pay off the loan in full, plus penalties. The bank would have no grounds to continue foreclosure proceedings. How quickly could we do that? I could have the funds transferred by close of business today. Abigail smiled. Perfect. And one more thing. I'd like to keep my inheritance quiet for now, as quiet as possible. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Client confidentiality is sacred to us, Miss Wilson. No one will hear about your new status from me or anyone at this firm. A hint of curiosity crept into his expression. May I ask why? Abigail thought of Judge Harrington's cold dismissal, his plans for her land, the humiliation she'd felt standing before him. Let's just say I'd like the chance to make my own first impression as Margaret Sutton's heir. 2 hours later, Abigail stood on the wide front porch of Sutton Ranch's main house, still struggling to process that it all belonged to her. The white 2-story farmhouse was grand without being ostentatious, with a wraparound porch complete with rocking chairs and hanging ferns. Behind it stretched fields and pastures as far as the eye could see, bordered by the silver ribbon of the Jefferson River. The house has been maintained by a caretaker couple, the Hendersons, explained Thornton's assistant, a young woman named Rachel, who had driven her to the property. They live in the guest house about a quarter-mile down the drive. They've been told to expect the new owner, though not specifically who you are. Abigail nodded, taking it all in. It's beautiful. Would you like to see inside? The interior was just as impressive. Spacious rooms with hardwood floors, a blend of antique furniture and more modern pieces, large windows that filled the space with natural light. It was clearly the home of someone with means, but it wasn't pretentious or showy. It felt comfortable, lived in, despite its owner's long absence. "The master bedroom is upstairs," Rachel said, leading the way up a graceful staircase, though Mrs. Sutton kept rooms ready for guests as well. The bedroom was large and airy, with a four-poster bed and windows overlooking the river. Abigail moved to one of them, gazing out at her new domain. From this vantage point, she could see where Sutton Ranch bordered other properties, including, in the distance, what must be the Wilson farm. Her farm. So close, yet they'd existed in separate worlds until today. "Rachel, how far is it to the Wilson property from here? The old Wilson place?" Rachel looked surprised. "It's adjacent to the northeast corner of Sutton Ranch. Maybe a 10-minute drive around by road, though it's closer as the crow flies. The properties share about a half-mile of boundary." So Margaret Sutton had lived right next door to her estranged family all those years, watching from a distance, but never bridging the gap. What a waste of time they could have had together. "Did you know Mrs. Sutton personally?" Abigail asked. Rachel smiled. "I only met her a few times when she would come back to check on the property. She was formidable, not someone you'd want to cross, but fair and generous to those she trusted." Formidable. Abigail liked the sound of that. "Rachel, I have a rather unusual favor to ask. I'd like to move in right away, tonight, if possible. Could you help me gather some essentials from my current home?" Rachel looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Thornton instructed me to assist you however I can." "Excellent. And one more thing. I'll need a suitable outfit for a dinner I'm attending tomorrow night. Something impressive." "Dinner?" Rachel asked. Abigail smiled, thinking of the charity gala announcement she'd spotted in the local paper that morning, the annual Jefferson County Bar Association benefit, with special guest speaker Judge James Harrington. The tickets were $500 each, an impossible expense yesterday, a trivial one today. "Yes," Abigail said, "I believe it's time for Margaret Sutton's heir to make her social debut." The next evening, Abigail hardly recognized herself in the full-length mirror of what was now her bedroom. The woman staring back at her wore a stunning emerald-green dress that hugged her curves before flowing gracefully to the floor. Her chestnut hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, had been styled into soft waves by the surprisingly talented Rachel. Delicate diamond earrings, purchased that afternoon in what would have been a month's farm income just days ago, sparkled at her ears. "You look amazing," Rachel said, making a final adjustment to the dress. "If you don't mind my saying so." "I hardly recognize myself," Abigail admitted. "That's not a bad thing given what you're planning." Abigail had shared a simplified version of her situation with Rachel, who had proven to be not just helpful, but enthusiastic about the chance to assist in what she called a little justified comeuppance. "Remember what we practiced," Rachel said. "Stand tall, make eye contact, speak confidently. You belong in that room just as much as anyone." Abigail nodded, though her stomach fluttered with butterflies. What she was planning wasn't exactly revenge, more like a lesson in consequences. Judge Harrington had dismissed her without a second thought when she was just a struggling farmer. How would he react when he discovered she now controlled the very property he coveted? "Your car is here," Rachel announced, peeking out the window. "Ready." The sleek black car, a luxury service arranged by Thornton's office, delivered Abigail to the Grand Jefferson Hotel precisely at 7:30. The hotel was Riverdale's finest establishment, a restored historic building that hosted all of the town's most prestigious events. As Abigail stepped out of the car, she took a deep breath and channeled every ounce of confidence she could muster. She was no longer the desperate woman in mud-splattered boots. Tonight, she was the heiress to Sutton Ranch, and she was about to make sure Judge James Harrington never forgot her face. The ballroom was already filled with Riverdale's elite when she arrived. Lawyers, doctors, business owners, and local politicians, all in formal attire, sipping champagne and engaging in the kind of small talk that greases the wheels of small city society. Abigail accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and scanned the room. It didn't take long to spot him. Judge Harrington stood near the center of the room, commanding attention in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was listening to an elderly man's animated story, a polite smile fixed on his face. Even from a distance, Abigail could see he was every bit as handsome as she'd first thought, and probably just as cold. She made her way slowly around the perimeter of the room, observing rather than engaging, waiting for the right moment. She noticed the older man from the courthouse, Richard, standing near the judge, deep in conversation with another man in an expensive suit. "Just a matter of time," Richard was saying as she passed. "Once that farm goes to auction, we'll be the only serious bidders. The rest of the land we need is already locked down." "And Sutton Ranch?" the other man asked. Richard's expression darkened. "A complication. Some heir showed up out of nowhere, but everybody has a price. We'll just have to make an offer they can't refuse." Abigail smiled to herself as she moved on. They were in for quite a surprise. She found a quiet corner from which to observe the room, sipping her champagne and gathering her courage. This wasn't her world. At least it hadn't been until yesterday. But if she was going to protect her new inheritance from people like Richard and Judge Harrington, she needed to learn how to navigate it. "Excuse me?" A warm, pleasant voice interrupted her thoughts. "I don't believe we've met." Abigail turned to find herself face to face with Elena Rodriguez, the public defender who had spoken to her at the courthouse. Elena looked elegant in a simple black dress, her expression one of polite curiosity that quickly shifted to shock as she recognized Abigail. "Miss Wilson, I almost didn't recognize you." Abigail smiled. "Please call me Abigail." Elena glanced at Abigail's dress, then back to her face. "I have to say, this is unexpected. These tickets are $500. "Yes, I know." Abigail took another sip of her champagne. "Let's just say my financial situation has improved rather dramatically since yesterday." Elena's eyebrows rose. "Clearly. Does this have anything to do with that phone call you received after court?" "It might." Abigail's smile widened slightly. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. I could use a friendly face and maybe a bit of advice." "What kind of advice?" "The kind that might help me navigate a delicate social situation with a certain judge." Understanding dawned in Elena's eyes. "You're here for Harrington. I'm here to introduce myself properly, as someone he might consider a peer, not someone he can dismiss without a second thought." Elena looked uncertain. "Abigail, I'm all for standing up for yourself, but antagonizing a judge isn't usually a wise career move." "I'm not planning to antagonize him," Abigail said innocently, "just to expand his understanding of the situation." Before Elena could respond, the room's attention shifted as a man stepped up to the microphone at the front. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats. Dinner will be served shortly, and we're honored to have Judge James Harrington speaking to us tonight about the importance of our legal aid initiatives." Abigail checked her table assignment, table 3 near the front. "Perfect." "Where are you sitting?" she asked Elena. "Table 12 in the back. The public defender's office didn't exactly spring for premium seats." "Switch with me," Abigail said impulsively. "I'll take 12, you take 3. Elena looked confused. "Why would you want to sit in the back?" "Because sometimes the best position isn't the most obvious one," Abigail replied with a smile. "Trust me." "You did." After a moment's hesitation, Elena agreed, and they exchanged place cards. Abigail made her way to table 12, where she found herself seated among a mix of lower-level legal staff and a few small business owners, the budget seats, far from the center of power. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of the head table, where Judge Harrington sat with what appeared to be other judges and senior attorneys. He looked perfectly at ease, the consummate professional in his element. The dinner proceeded with the usual formalities, speeches from the Bar Association president, acknowledgements of sponsors, awards for community service. Abigail ate little of the surprisingly good meal, her attention focused on the moment that was coming. Finally, it was time for the keynote address. Judge Harrington approached the podium with confident steps, his expression serious but engaging as he surveyed the room. "Distinguished colleagues, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice filling the space effortlessly. "It is my privilege to speak to you tonight about a cause close to my heart, equal access to justice for all citizens, regardless of their financial means." Abigail nearly choked on her water. Equal access to justice? From the man who had humiliated her for not knowing proper court procedure? "In my courtroom, I see every day the challenges faced by those who cannot afford quality legal representation," he continued. "While our legal system is the best in the world, we must acknowledge that without proper advocacy, even the most deserving case can fail." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Abigail listened as he spoke eloquently about the importance of legal aid programs, pro bono work, and making the law accessible to ordinary citizens. His words were perfect, compassionate, thoughtful, inspiring. If she hadn't experienced the reality of his courtroom firsthand, she might have been moved. When he finished to enthusiastic applause, the evening shifted to the fundraising portion, an auction of donated items to benefit the Bar Association's Legal Aid Fund. Abigail watched as luxury goods, weekend getaways, and sports memorabilia were sold to the highest bidders, raising thousands of dollars in small increments. The final item was announced with particular fanfare: a private dinner for 6 prepared by celebrity chef Marcus Bell in the home of the winning bidder. Chef Bell, whose restaurant just received its 2nd Michelin star, has generously donated his time and talent for this exceptional experience. The bidding started at $2,000 and quickly escalated. Abigail watched as hands around the room went up and down, the price climbing steadily. Judge Harrington entered the bidding at $5,000, looking confident that few in the room would challenge him. At $7,000, only the judge and Richard remained in the bidding war. At $10,000, Richard bowed out with a good-natured gesture of defeat. "Going once for $10,000 to Judge Harrington," the auctioneer announced. "Going twice." "$15,000, Abigail called clearly from her table in the back. Every head in the room turned toward her. Judge Harrington's expression was one of surprise, not recognition, just surprise that someone had outbid him so dramatically. $15,000 from the lady in green, the auctioneer said, clearly pleased by this development. "Do I hear 16? Judge Harrington hesitated only briefly before raising his hand. $16,000. Abigail smiled directly at him. $20,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Judge Harrington frowned slightly, trying to place her face. $20,000, the auctioneer repeated, excitement evident in his voice. "This is a record for our event, ladies and gentlemen. Judge Harrington, do I hear 21? The judge studied Abigail for a long moment, then shook his head with a small, gracious smile. "The lady's generosity exceeds mine. I concede." "Sold to the lady in green for $20,000, the auctioneer declared triumphantly. "Please come forward to claim your prize and introduce yourself." This was the moment Abigail had been waiting for. She rose gracefully and made her way to the front of the room, feeling every eye upon her. As she approached the podium, she watched Judge Harrington's expression, waiting for the moment of recognition. It came just as she reached the steps to the stage. The slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his posture as he realized exactly who had just outbid him. "Your name for our records, ma'am?" the auctioneer asked as he handed her a certificate. Abigail took the microphone, her eyes locked with Judge Harrington's. "Abigail Wilson, the new owner of Sutton Ranch." The judge's composed facade cracked for just an instant, a flash of shock quickly masked by his professional demeanor. But Abigail had seen it, and it was worth every penny of the $20,000. "Ms. Wilson has just made the largest single donation in our event's history," the auctioneer announced to enthusiastic applause. "And as our final item of the evening, she's entitled to say a few words if she wishes." Abigail hadn't planned on speaking, but the opportunity was too perfect to pass up. "Thank you," she said into the microphone. I'm relatively new to Riverdale's social scene, having just recently inherited my great-aunt Margaret Sutton's estate. But I've always believed in equal access to justice, the kind where everyone, regardless of their background or legal expertise, deserves to be treated with respect in our courts. She paused, meeting Judge Harrington's gaze directly. I look forward to getting to know many of you better, and to becoming an active part of this community. In fact, Judge Harrington, since I've just purchased a dinner for 6, I'd like to invite you to be one of my guests. I believe we have some property matters to discuss. The judge's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his social training didn't desert him. I would be honored, Miss Wilson. Abigail smiled sweetly. Excellent. I'll be in touch with the details. She turned back to the audience. Thank you all for your warm welcome to Riverdale Society. I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of a very interesting relationship. As she stepped down from the stage, Abigail caught sight of Richard's face, pale with shock as he whispered urgently to a colleague. Judge Harrington's expression had returned to its usual composed mask, but his eyes followed her as she made her way back to her table. The first round had gone to her. But Abigail had a feeling that Judge James Harrington wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily, and the real battle was just beginning. Are you absolutely certain about this? Rachel asked, arranging a vase of fresh-cut wildflowers on the dining room table. Inviting Judge Harrington here after what happened in court? Abigail surveyed the beautifully set table, fine china that had belonged to Margaret Sutton, crystal glasses that caught the late afternoon sunlight, silver cutlery polished to a mirror shine. Everything was perfect for the dinner party she was hosting that evening, her first official social event as the owner of Sutton Ranch. I'm certain, she replied, adjusting a place card that read, Honored James Harrington in elegant calligraphy. If I'm going to protect this land, both properties, I need to understand exactly what I'm up against. It had been 3 days since the charity gala, 3 days in which Abigail's life had transformed completely. The Wilson farm foreclosure had been halted with a single bank transfer. Her few belongings had been moved to Sutton Ranch, and the news of her inheritance had spread through Riverdale like wildfire, despite her initial attempts at discretion. Most surprising was the community's reaction. Instead of jealousy or resentment, Abigail had experienced a wave of genuine goodwill. Neighbors who had sympathized with her struggles now celebrated her good fortune. Local business owners who had extended credit during lean times refused payment, insisting it was their gift to her. Even the bank manager, who had pursued the foreclosure, sent flowers with a note expressing his delight at this fortunate turn of events. The only person who hadn't reached out was Judge James Harrington, until yesterday, when his office had called to formally accept her dinner invitation. Chef Bell will be here at 5 to begin preparations, Rachel said, consulting her tablet. Guests arrive at 7. The other 5 attendees confirmed are Elena Rodriguez, Michael Thornton, Dr. Sarah Chen, Mayor Phillips, and... She hesitated. And, Abigail prompted, Richard Harrington, the judge's father. He called this morning to ask if he could attend in place of the 6th guest you hadn't yet named. I wasn't sure what to tell him. Abigail's eyebrows rose. How interesting. The judge is bringing reinforcements. Should I have declined? No, it's perfect, actually. 2 Harringtons for the price of 1. Abigail smiled. Let's add another place setting. Rachel looked concerned. Abigail, I know it's not my place to say this, but be careful. The Harringtons are powerful in this county. They've been here for generations, and they have connections everywhere. So did Margaret Sutton, apparently. And now I have her resources. Abigail's expression softened. I appreciate the concern, Rachel, but I'm not planning to declare war. I just want to make it clear that Sutton Ranch isn't for sale, at any price. And the Wilson farm? Will you keep that too? Abigail nodded. That land is my parents' legacy. I couldn't save it on my own, but now... She trailed off, emotion catching in her throat. Now I can honor their memory properly. Rachel squeezed her arm gently. They would be proud of you. I hope so. Abigail straightened her shoulders. Now, I should go get ready. Can't have the new lady of the manor looking anything less than perfect, can we? At precisely 7 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Michael Thornton came first, punctual as Abigail expected, bringing a bottle of expensive wine and a fatherly air of protection. Elena followed soon after, then Dr. Chen, the county's most respected physician and a prominent community leader, and Mayor Phillips, a jovial man with political ambitions beyond their small town. They gathered in the formal living room, accepting drinks from the professional bartender Abigail had hired for the evening. The conversation flowed easily, with curiosity about Abigail's sudden change in fortune, the primary topic. I must say, Ms. Wilson, you've handled this transition with remarkable grace, Mayor Phillips said, raising his glass in a small toast. Not everyone could adjust so quickly to such a dramatic change in circumstances. Thank you, Mayor, but I'm still the same person I was before, Abigail replied, just with more resources to work with. And quite a bit more influence, Dr. Chen added with a knowing smile. Sutton Ranch has always been a cornerstone of this county's economy. Speaking of which, Thornton interjected smoothly, Abigail has some wonderful ideas for agricultural innovations on both properties, sustainable farming practices that could become a model for the region. The mayor leaned forward with interest. I'd love to hear more about that. The county council has been discussing ways to balance development with preserving our agricultural heritage. Before Abigail could respond, the doorbell chimed again. The final guests had arrived. The Henderson's son Jimmy, hired as doorman for the evening, appeared at the living room entrance. Judge James Harrington and Mr. Richard Harrington, he announced with as much formality as a 16-year-old could muster. The two men who entered the room couldn't have been more different physically. Where Judge Harrington was tall and athletic with dark hair, his father was shorter, stouter, with a full head of silver hair and the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed good food and better whiskey. But their bearing was identical, confident, almost regal, as if their place at the top of the local social hierarchy was simply a fact of nature. Abigail moved forward to greet them, determined not to show a hint of intimidation. Judge Harrington, Mr. Harrington, thank you for coming. She extended her hand to each in turn. Welcome to Sutton Ranch. Ms. Wilson. The judge's handshake was firm, his expression professionally pleasant but guarded. Up close, she noticed details she'd missed in the courtroom. A small scar near his right eyebrow, the way one corner of his mouth lifted slightly higher than the other when he smiled. Thank you for the invitation. Your home is lovely. Please, call me Abigail. She turned to the older Harrington. And Mr. Harrington, I'm delighted you could join us as well. Richard Harrington's handshake was a shade too firm, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I hope you don't mind my intrusion. When James mentioned your generous invitation, I couldn't resist the opportunity to meet Margaret Sutton's heir. Margaret and I had many dealings over the years, mostly adversarial, I'm afraid. I've heard she could be formidable, Abigail replied mildly. That's one word for it. Richard chuckled, but there was an edge to it. Stubborn as a mule would be another. She turned down some extremely generous offers for this property. Well, it seems the apple doesn't fall far from the tree then, Abigail said with a smile that matched his for warmth. Can I offer you both a drink? As the bartender prepared their selections, Scotch for Richard, bourbon for the judge, Abigail guided them toward the other guests. The dynamics in the room shifted subtly as the Harringtons joined the group. The mayor became more deferential, Dr. Chen more reserved, while Thornton watched everything with the careful attention of someone cataloguing information for later use. Only Elena seemed unaffected, greeting the judge with the casual respect of a professional colleague rather than the deference he clearly expected. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Harrington nodded. I didn't realize you and Ms. Wilson were acquainted. We met at the courthouse, actually, Elena replied. "The day of Abigail's foreclosure hearing." A flicker of discomfort crossed the judge's face. "Ah, yes, an unfortunate situation that appears to have resolved itself quite fortuitously." "Indeed," Abigail agreed. "The timing of my inheritance couldn't have been more perfect." Richard Harrington made a noise that might have been a suppressed snort. Convenient, certainly. Before anyone could respond to that loaded comment, Jimmy appeared again. "Chef Bell says dinner is ready to be served whenever you'd like, Miss Wilson." "Thank you, Jimmy. I think we're ready now." Abigail turned to her guests. "Shall we?" The dining room elicited appreciative murmurs as they entered. Rachel had outdone herself with the decorations, subtle, elegant, with just enough formality to honor the occasion without being stuffy. Chef Bell, a handsome man in his 40s, with the confident demeanor of someone who knew exactly how good he was at his job, greeted them with a warm smile. "Good evening, everyone. I've prepared a 5-course tasting menu highlighting the best local ingredients, including some wonderful produce from Sutton Ranch itself. We'll begin with a chilled cucumber soup with lemon verbena and local crab." As they took their seats, Abigail at the head of the table, with Judge Harrington to her right and Richard to her left, the first course arrived. The conversation flowed naturally to safer topics. The unusually mild spring weather, the upcoming county fair, Dr. Chen's recent medical mission to Guatemala. It wasn't until the second course, a delicate salad of heirloom tomatoes and burrata, that Richard Harrington steered the conversation to more strategic waters. "Tell me, Ms. Wilson, what are your plans for Sutton Ranch? Such a large property must be quite a responsibility for someone with your limited agricultural experience." Abigail met his gaze evenly. "Actually, Mr. Harrington, I grew up farming. The Wilson property has been in my family for 4 generations. A charming family farm, to be sure," Richard said dismissively. "But Sutton Ranch is an operation of an entirely different scale. Margaret employed dozens of people, managed complex water rights, navigated agricultural regulations. It's not exactly something one learns overnight." "Fortunately," Abigail replied, "Margaret left the ranch in excellent condition, with experienced staff who are staying on, and Mr. Thornton has been invaluable in helping me understand the business aspects." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Admirable, but perhaps impractical in the long term. Many inheritors of such properties find that selling to experienced developers is ultimately the most sensible option." "Developers like Harrington Luxury Developments, you mean?" Abigail asked innocently. A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. "Our firm has a strong track record of creating value from underutilized land," Richard said finally. "We'd be happy to discuss potential opportunities that would benefit both you and the wider community." "By underutilized, do you mean actively farmed agricultural land that produces food, provides jobs, and has been in the same family for generations?" Abigail kept her tone light, but there was steel beneath the words. The judge cleared his throat. "Perhaps this isn't the best setting for business discussions, Father?" "On the contrary," Abigail said, "I think it's the perfect setting. We're all enjoying the fruits of local agriculture, quite literally." She gestured to their plates. "These tomatoes were grown right here on Sutton Ranch. The herbs in the soup came from the kitchen garden outside. The wine with our next course is from a vineyard that leases the southeast corner of the property." She turned her gaze directly to the judge. "Tell me, Judge Harrington, do you believe that developing this land into luxury homes would be a better use of these resources?" The judge met her challenge with calm professionalism. "Land use is a complex issue with many competing interests to balance. Development creates jobs, expands the tax base, and provides housing. Agriculture feeds people and preserves open space. There's no simple right or wrong answer." "A very judicial response," Abigail noted. "Diplomatic and non-committal." A hint of a genuine smile touched the judge's lips. "Occupational hazard, I'm afraid." "If I may," Mayor Phillips interjected, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. The county's master plan actually emphasizes the importance of maintaining our agricultural heritage while allowing for strategic development in designated areas. It's not an either-or proposition. Exactly right, Richard agreed eagerly. And our proposal for Riverside Estates would preserve significant green space while bringing high-end home buyers into the county. People who would support local businesses, contribute to the tax base, and enhance the community. Riverside Estates, Abigail repeated. Is that what you're planning to call the development you want to build on my land? Richard had the grace to look slightly abashed. A preliminary name only, and of course any actual development would require willing sellers. Which I'm not, Abigail stated firmly. Sutton Ranch will remain agricultural land as long as I own it. And how long will that be? Richard challenged. Running a ranch of this size isn't just hard work, it's expensive. Property taxes, equipment maintenance, payroll, insurance. The costs add up quickly. Without Margaret's business acumen, I believe in Abigail's capability to manage the estate, Thornton interrupted smoothly. Margaret Sutton herself had great confidence in her, which is why she left her the property without restrictions. Well, with one small time-based condition. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Condition? Thornton looked to Abigail, who nodded her permission. Abigail must maintain ownership of the ranch for 1 year, before she can sell any portion of it, he explained. Margaret wanted to ensure her heir gave ranch life a fair chance before making any irreversible decisions. Richard's expression darkened. A year is a long time in the development world. Markets change, investors move on to other opportunities. I'm sure they do, Abigail agreed pleasantly. Fortunately, that's not my concern. Before Richard could respond, Chef Bell appeared with the third course, a perfect fillet of locally caught trout with spring vegetables. For this course, the chef announced, I've paired a Viognier from Sunridge Vineyards, located right here on Sutton Ranch property. It has lovely notes of apricot and honeysuckle that complement the delicate flavor of the trout. As they enjoyed the exquisite dish, the conversation shifted again to safer ground. Dr. Chen discussed recent healthcare initiatives in the county. Elena shared an amusing anecdote about a case involving a dispute over a prize-winning rooster. Thornton reminisced about his early days as a young attorney in Riverdale. Abigail watched Judge Harrington throughout, noting how he engaged thoughtfully with each topic, revealing an intelligence and breadth of knowledge that went beyond legal matters. He was more relaxed now than she'd seen him before, though still guarded. Occasionally, she caught him observing her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity, perhaps, or reassessment. It wasn't until the dessert course, an elegant chocolate soufflé with salted caramel ice cream, that Richard Harrington returned to the offensive. Ms. Wilson, forgiveness if this seems forward, but I feel I should make you aware of certain realities, he began, setting down his spoon. Riverdale is a small community with long memories. Those of us who have been here for generations, like the Harringtons, like the Suttons, understand that certain courtesies are expected. Courtesies? Abigail repeated. Consulting with established interests before making decisions that might affect the broader community, Richard clarified. Margaret understood this, despite her occasional stubbornness. She knew the importance of maintaining good relationships with influential families. Father, the judge said, a warning note in his voice. But Richard pressed on. I'll be direct. Your sudden appearance and equally sudden fortune have raised eyebrows. People are asking questions about the timing, about your qualifications to step into Margaret Sutton's shoes, about your intentions. My intentions are quite simple, Abigail replied evenly. To honor my family's legacy, both the Wilson and Sutton sides, by being a good steward of the land that's been entrusted to me. Noble sentiments, Richard said with a dismissive wave. But this county runs on practical realities. The Harrington name carries weight here, in business, in government, in the courts. It would be unfortunate if your idealism, led to unnecessary difficulties. The table fell silent. Mayor Phillips studied his dessert with sudden fascination. Dr. Chen and Elena exchanged concerned glances. Only Thornton seemed unperturbed, watching the exchange with the calm detachment of someone who had seen such power plays before. Judge Harrington set his napkin on the table, his expression tight with controlled anger. "That's enough, Father. You're out of line." "I'm simply offering Ms. Wilson some friendly advice," Richard protested, "as someone with her best interests at heart." "No. You're issuing a thinly veiled threat at a social gathering to which you invited yourself," the judge said coldly. "And you're potentially compromising my judicial impartiality by suggesting our family name influences court decisions." Abigail watched this unexpected development with interest. The judge's reaction seemed genuine and principled. "James has always been excessively concerned with appearances," Richard said to Abigail with a forced laugh. "I meant no offense, of course, just offering the benefit of my experience in local matters." "No offense taken, Mr. Harrington," Abigail replied calmly. "In fact, I appreciate your candor. It's always useful to know exactly where one stands." She turned to the table at large. "And since we're being candid, I should make my position equally clear. I have no intention of selling either property, not Sutton Ranch, not the Wilson Farm, not in a year, not ever. Both represent my family's heritage, and I intend to honor that heritage by keeping them productive and whole." She met Richard's gaze directly. "If that creates unnecessary difficulties for those with other plans for my land, I'm prepared to face those difficulties head-on. Margaret Sutton wasn't the only stubborn woman in the family." For a moment, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Harrington raised his wineglass. "To stubborn women," he said, with what appeared to be a genuine smile, "without whom this county would be considerably less interesting." The toast broke the tension, drawing relieved laughter from the other guests. Even Richard managed a tight smile, though his eyes remained cold. As coffee and digestives were served, the conversation fragmented into smaller discussions. Mayor Phillips engaged Richard in a discussion of the county budget. Dr. Chen and Thornton debated healthcare legislation. And somehow, Abigail found herself in conversation with Judge Harrington, who had moved to a chair closer to hers during the reshuffling. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Wilson," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Abigail raised her eyebrows in surprise. "For your father's behavior? That's hardly your responsibility." "No, for my own, in my courtroom." The judge looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I was unnecessarily harsh with you during your foreclosure hearing." "You were doing your job," Abigail said carefully, "applying the law as written." He shook his head slightly. "The law requires impartiality and procedural correctness. It doesn't require dismissiveness or condescension toward pro-se litigants. For that I apologize." Abigail studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine contrition or merely strategic damage control. "May I ask what prompted this apology?" she asked. "My suddenly improved financial situation, perhaps?" A flash of something, annoyance, respect, crossed his face. "I deserve that suspicion. But no. Actually, it was Elena who took me to task after your hearing. She pointed out rather forcefully that I had failed to live up to my own stated principles about equal access to justice." Abigail glanced toward Elena, who was now deep in conversation with Dr. Chen. "She seems like a good friend to have. She's an excellent attorney and an even better conscience," the judge agreed. "And she was right. I should have directed you to legal resources, explained procedures more clearly, or at minimum treated your situation with more compassion." "Well," Abigail said after a moment, "I accept your apology. And I apologize if my method of introduction at the charity gala was theatrical." That earned a genuine laugh from the judge. "It was certainly effective. I don't think I've ever been so thoroughly outmaneuvered at a charity auction. $20,000 to a good cause. Seems like a small price to pay for making an impression, Abigail replied with a smile. Consider the impression made. His expression turned more serious. About my father. You don't need to explain him either. Perhaps not, but I should clarify something important. Despite what he implied, my family name has no influence in my courtroom. I've recused myself from cases involving Harrington developments precisely to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Including cases involving land they're interested in acquiring? Abigail asked pointedly. The judge's expression tightened. I was unaware of my father's interest in your property at the time of your foreclosure hearing. Had I known, I would have recused myself. And yet, immediately after the hearing, you were discussing development possibilities with him. He approached me about a property facing foreclosure. I told him, as I always do, that I couldn't discuss specific cases. Judge Harrington's jaw tensed. I should have walked away from the conversation entirely, and I accept that criticism. But I want to be clear, I did not rule against you because of any development plans. Abigail considered this. You ruled against me because the bank had the law on its side, and I didn't know how to fight it properly. Yes, his directness was unexpected. The outcome would likely have been the same even with legal representation, given the facts of the case. But you deserved better treatment in my courtroom, regardless of the ultimate ruling. Before Abigail could respond, Richard Harrington pushed back from the table. It's getting late, he announced. James, we should be going. The judge looked like he wanted to continue their conversation, but nodded and stood. Yes, of course. Ms. Wilson, thank you for a lovely evening. Abigail, please, she reminded him. Abigail. He hesitated, then added, and I hope you'll call me James, at least outside the courtroom. As the guests prepared to leave, Richard pulled Abigail aside near the front door. You've made an impressive start, he said quietly, but this is a marathon, not a sprint. Think carefully about the long game before you commit yourself to an untenable position. Abigail smiled pleasantly. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Harrington. But I learned something important growing up on a farm. The best way to deal with a bull is to face it head-on and never show fear. Richard's eyes hardened. Be careful, Ms. Wilson. Bulls have been known to gore those who underestimate them. Father, the car is waiting, James called from the doorway, his tone making it clear he'd overheard at least part of the exchange. With a final nod to Abigail, Richard joined his son, and they departed into the warm spring night. As the last guests said their goodbyes and Chef Bell packed up his equipment, Abigail stood on the porch, looking out over the moonlit expanse of Sutton Ranch. Her ranch now. The evening had been revealing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Richard Harrington was exactly the ruthless developer she'd expected, but his son, Judge James Harrington, was proving more complicated. So, Rachel said, joining her on the porch, how did it go? Abigail smiled. Let's just say the battle lines have been drawn. And Judge Harrington? Is he as bad as you thought? Abigail considered the question, remembering the judge's unexpected apology, the way he'd stood up to his father, the complexity she'd glimpsed beneath his professional exterior. No, she said finally, he's not what I expected at all. Whether that made him an ally or a more dangerous opponent remained to be seen. The Jefferson River glittered like spilled diamonds in the early morning light as Abigail guided her horse along its banks. Dawn rides had become her favorite part of the day in the 3 weeks since she'd moved to Sutton Ranch, a quiet time to explore her new property and gather her thoughts before the demands of the day began. Today she'd chosen to ride along the river boundary that separated Sutton Ranch from the Wilson farm. From this vantage point, she could see both properties, her past and her future, spread out before her like pages of a story still being written. The Wilson farmhouse looked small and weathered from this distance, its white paint peeling in places, the red barn roof in need of repair. Yet it still held the comfortable familiarity of home. In contrast, the main house of Sutton Ranch rose majestically on its gentle hill, surrounded by mature oak trees. Beautiful, but still feeling borrowed, like a dress that hadn't quite molded to her shape. "What do you think, monarch?" she asked the chestnut gelding beneath her. "Am I crazy to try to keep both places running?" The horse flicked his ears back at the sound of her voice, but offered no opinion on her financial decisions. Since the dinner party 3 weeks ago, Abigail had thrown herself into learning everything she could about managing Sutton Ranch. She'd spent days with the ranch foreman, Tom Davis, a taciturn man in his 50s who'd worked for Margaret Sutton for over 20 years. She'd pored over financial statements and land management plans with Thornton. She'd met with every tenant farmer who leased portions of the property, learning about their operations and concerns. And she'd begun implementing changes at the Wilson farm as well, hiring workers to repair buildings and fences, purchasing new equipment to replace the aging machinery that had limped along for years past its prime. The farm manager she'd hired, a capable woman named Maria Gonzalez with an agricultural science degree and practical experience, had already developed a revitalization plan that would make the Wilson property productive again. All of this activity had kept Abigail too busy to dwell on Richard Harrington's veiled threats or his son's unexpected complexity. But this morning, as she rode along the river, her thoughts kept returning to Judge James Harrington and the glimpses of the man behind the judicial facade. She hadn't seen him since the dinner party. According to Elena, with whom she'd developed a genuine friendship, the judge had been unusually subdued in court recently. "Almost like he's second-guessing himself," Elena had observed. "Very un-Harrington-like." Abigail's musings were interrupted by the sound of splashing ahead. Rounding a bend in the river, she pulled Monarch to a halt at the unexpected sight before her. A man stood knee-deep in the river, fly-fishing with practiced grace. His back was to her, but there was something familiar about his tall frame and the set of his shoulders. As if sensing her presence, he turned, and Abigail found herself looking at Judge James Harrington. He seemed as surprised to see her as she was to find him. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the gentle gurgle of the river flowing around his waders. "Good morning," he called finally, his deep voice carrying easily across the water. "Good morning," Abigail replied, guiding Monarch closer to the riverbank. "I didn't realize I had trespassers on my property." A flash of concern crossed his face. "Am I trespassing? I've been fishing this spot for years. It's always been public access." Abigail smiled to show she was teasing. "The river itself is public. You're fine as long as you stay wet." Relief replaced his concern. "I always do. It's better fishing midstream anyway." He gestured with his rod to the clear water around him. "The trout hold in that deeper channel by the fallen log." "Catch anything?" "Two so far, catch and release." Abigail nodded her approval. "Responsible sportsman." "I try to be." He studied her with interest. "You're up early. Best time to ride. The light is beautiful, and it's peaceful." She patted Monarch's neck. "Plus this guy gets cranky if he doesn't get his morning exercise." The judge smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "I know the feeling. That's why I'm out here at dawn, too. Clears my head before court." An awkward silence fell between them, filled by the gentle sounds of the river and the occasional call of a bird. "Would you like to join me for coffee?" Abigail found herself asking, surprising herself. "I packed some in a thermos. There's a nice spot to sit just upstream." He hesitated, looking down at his waders. "I'm not exactly dressed for social calls." "Neither am I," she pointed out, gesturing to her jeans and flannel shirt. "And it's hardly a social call, just coffee by the river." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Let me just reel in. I'll meet you upstream." Abigail continued along the riverbank to a small clearing she'd discovered during previous rides. A fallen tree trunk provided a natural bench overlooking a peaceful stretch of the river. She dismounted, tied Monarch to a nearby tree where he could graze on the lush grass, and retrieved the thermos and 2 collapsible cups from her saddlebag. By the time the judge arrived, splashing through the shallow water near the shore, she had poured 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Cream or sugar?" she asked. "Black is fine, thank you." He carefully placed his fishing rod aside and lowered himself onto the log beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Water dripped from his waders, creating small, dark patches in the soil. She handed him a cup. "Here you go. Nothing fancy, I'm afraid." "The best coffee is always outdoors," he replied, taking an appreciative sip. "Thank you." Up close, out of his judicial robes and formal suits, James Harrington looked different, more approachable, more human. He wore a simple flannel shirt not unlike her own, though of obviously better quality, and a well-worn fishing vest covered in small pockets and attachments, whose purposes Abigail could only guess at. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the morning breeze, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. "So," she said after a moment, "you fish." "Since I was a boy. My grandfather taught me, not my father." A wry smile touched his lips. "Dad never had the patience for it. Too slow, too contemplative." "That doesn't surprise me. I imagine it wouldn't, after meeting him." James looked out over the river. "My father sees the world very differently than I do. Land is always potential development to him. Rivers are amenities to increase property values. And to you?" He considered the question seriously. "To me, land is context, history, community. Rivers are living things, connecting past and present." He shook his head with a self-deprecating laugh. "Sorry, that sounds pretentious." "Not at all," Abigail said. "It sounds like you actually care about this place." "I do." He looked at her with unexpected intensity. "Which is why I need to apologize again." "We've already covered the courtroom apology," she reminded him. "This is different. It's about my father's development plans." James set his coffee cup down on the log. "I should have made it clearer that I have no financial interest in Harrington Developments. I resigned from the board when I became a judge, and I've distanced myself from the company's decisions." "But you're still a Harrington." "Yes, and I can't deny that I benefit from the family name and fortune." He met her gaze directly. "But I want you to know that I don't support my father's tactics. The veiled threats, the pressure, that's not how I do business or dispense justice." Abigail studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," he hesitated, "because I think you're trying to do something worthwhile here. Preserving these properties, maintaining their agricultural purpose, that matters. And because I don't want you to see me as the enemy just because of my last name, even though I'm standing in the way of your family's business interests. My family's business interests aren't always aligned with what's best for this county." The admission seemed to cost him something. "And they're certainly not always aligned with my personal values." Abigail felt a shift in her perception of the man beside her, a complexity that went beyond her initial impression of the cold, dismissive judge, or even the more nuanced figure from the dinner party. "That can't be easy," she said finally, "standing between two worlds." "It's not," he agreed, "but it's the position I've chosen." He took another sip of coffee. "What about you? How are you finding life as a sudden heiress?" The change of subject was obvious, but Abigail accepted it. "Overwhelming, exciting, terrifying, sometimes all at once." "Terrifying, even with all those resources at your disposal?" "Maybe because of them," she admitted. "Before, my biggest worry was keeping the lights on at the Wilson farm. Now I'm responsible for thousands of acres, dozens of employees, complex business relationships. One wrong decision could affect so many people's livelihoods." "That's a very conscientious perspective," James observed. "Most people in your position would be focused on how to enjoy their newfound wealth." Abigail shrugged. "Don't get me wrong, I've bought a few nice things. It's amazing how much better you sleep on high-quality sheets." She smiled. "But that's not why Margaret left me this place. She wanted it preserved, not liquidated for a shopping spree." "You sound sure of her intentions." "I am. The more I learn about her, the more I understand why she made the choices she did." Abigail looked across the river toward the Wilson farm. She watched from a distance as my family struggled. She didn't intervene directly. Maybe pride kept her from that, but she made sure the land would be protected after she was gone. That was her priority. And now it's yours. Yes. Abigail turned back to him, which is why your father's threats, veiled or otherwise, won't change my mind. Sutton Ranch isn't for sale. James nodded slowly. I understand, and for what it's worth, I respect your position. He glanced at his watch. I should probably get going. Court starts at 9, and I still need to change. Of course. Abigail stood, collecting their empty cups. Thanks for the company. Thank you for the coffee. He hesitated, then added, I fish here most mornings, weather permitting, around the same time. Abigail recognized the implied invitation. I usually ride this trail on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Good to know. A smile touched his lips again, that genuine smile that transformed his face. Maybe our paths will cross again. Maybe they will, she agreed. As she watched him wade back into the river to retrieve his gear, Abigail found herself unexpectedly looking forward to Thursday morning. True to his word, James was fishing in the same spot when Abigail rode Monarch along the riverbank 2 days later. Their second riverside coffee was less awkward than the first, the conversation flowing more naturally. He told her about a complicated case involving water rights that had come before his court. She shared her plans for implementing sustainable farming practices on both properties. The following Tuesday, he brought the coffee, a special blend from his favorite local roaster, and homemade blueberry muffins that he somewhat sheepishly admitted he'd baked himself. A judge who bakes? Abigail teased, taking a bite of the surprisingly delicious muffin. That seems like classified information. Strictly need-to-know basis, he agreed with a smile. It's not exactly consistent with the Iceman reputation. I promise your culinary skills will remain our secret, she assured him. Their riverside meetings became an unacknowledged routine. Twice a week, weather permitting, for coffee and conversation as the sun rose over the Jefferson River. They established an unspoken boundary. No discussion of Richard Harrington's development plans or the growing tension between Abigail and the Harrington patriarch. And there was tension. Richard had moved from veiled threats to more overt pressure, reaching out to Abigail's tenant farmers with offers to buy them out of their leases, contacting the bank that held Margaret Sutton's remaining business loans with suggestions about reassessing the risk profile of the new owner. Thornton had handled each challenge smoothly, but the message was clear. Richard Harrington wasn't giving up on his plans for Riverside Estates. Abigail didn't mention these skirmishes during her mornings with James, and he didn't ask. Instead, they discovered shared interests in literature, environmental conservation, and, surprisingly, old Western films. My grandmother loved John Wayne movies, Abigail explained during one morning conversation. We'd watch them together every Saturday afternoon when I was growing up. Rio Bravo was her favorite. Good taste, James approved, though I've always preferred The Searchers, more moral complexity. That makes sense, given your profession. Judging isn't always about moral complexity, he said thoughtfully. Sometimes the law is quite clear, even when the morality isn't. And sometimes the law doesn't account for human realities, Abigail countered. True, he studied her with interest. You know, you have a surprisingly nuanced understanding of legal philosophy for someone who struggled with courtroom procedure. Procedure is different from principle, she replied. I understand why the law exists. I just didn't know how to navigate its technical requirements. That's a fair distinction. He hesitated, then added, if you're interested, there's a legal clinic at the community college. They help people understand basic courtroom procedures, how to file documents correctly, that sort of thing. I volunteer there sometimes. Teaching regular people how to navigate your intimidating domain? Abigail smiled. That seems out of character for the Iceman. Maybe the Iceman isn't who I really am, he suggested quietly. Their eyes met, and Abigail felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then James cleared his throat and glanced at his watch. "I should get going. Early docket today." "Of course." Abigail stood, brushing muffin crumbs from her jeans. "Thanks for breakfast." "My pleasure." He gathered his fishing gear. "See you Thursday?" "I'll be here." As she rode back to Sutton Ranch, Abigail tried to make sense of her conflicted feelings. James Harrington was nothing like she'd initially thought. Or rather, he was more than she'd thought. Behind the stern judge was a thoughtful, complex man with his own struggles and principles. A man she was increasingly enjoying spending time with. But he was still a Harrington. His father was still actively trying to undermine her position as owner of Sutton Ranch, and despite James's assurances that he'd distanced himself from the family business, blood ties weren't so easily severed. Rachel was waiting for her when she returned to the stable, an expression of concern on her face. "Everything okay?" Abigail asked as she dismounted. "There's been an incident at the Wilson farm," Rachel replied. "Maria called about 20 minutes ago. Someone cut the fence along the north pasture overnight. A dozen cattle got out and wandered onto the highway. There was an accident." Abigail's heart sank. "Was anyone hurt?" "Fortunately, no. The driver swerved and hit a guardrail instead of the cattle, but his car is damaged and he's threatening to sue." "The fence was cut, not just broken?" Rachel nodded grimly. "Maria found the wire cutters left at the scene. Brand new, expensive ones. That's not an accident, that's vandalism." Anger rose in Abigail's chest. Or intimidation. "Maria called the sheriff. They're taking a report, but they probably won't do much," Abigail finished. "Any witnesses?" "None so far. It happened sometime after midnight, apparently." Abigail handed Monarch's reins to the stable hand who had approached. "I need to go see this for myself. Can you ask Tom to meet me there, and call Michael Thornton? He should know about this too." An hour later, Abigail stood at the damaged fence line of the Wilson farm, surveying the scene with Maria, Tom, and Sheriff Carlton, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a perpetually tired expression. "Could have been teenagers," the sheriff suggested, examining the clean cuts in the heavy wire fencing. "They pull these kinds of pranks sometimes." "Teenagers don't typically carry $300 professional wire cutters," Tom pointed out, holding up the tool that had been found nearby in an evidence bag. "And they don't usually target specific properties." The sheriff shrugged. "Hard to prove intent either way." "This is the third incident at the Wilson property in 2 weeks," Abigail said, struggling to keep her voice level. "First, the irrigation system was tampered with. Then someone poured sugar in the gas tank of our new tractor. Now this. That's not random vandalism. That's a pattern." "Ms. Wilson, I understand you're upset," Sheriff Carlton said placatingly. "But without witnesses or concrete evidence linking these events to a specific person, there's not much I can do beyond filing reports. And if I told you I have strong reason to believe these incidents are connected to Richard Harrington's attempts to pressure me into selling my properties?" The sheriff's expression closed off immediately. "That would be a very serious accusation against a prominent citizen, Miss Wilson. One you shouldn't make without substantial proof." "So the Harrington name does carry weight even with law enforcement," Abigail observed coldly. Sheriff Carlton's face flushed. "I enforce the law equally for everyone, Ms. Wilson. But I need evidence to act, not speculation or personal grudges." Before Abigail could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. Michael Thornton's silver Lexus pulled up beside the sheriff's cruiser. "Sheriff Carlton," Thornton greeted as he approached, nodding respectfully. "I see you're already investigating. Good." "Just taking preliminary statements, Michael," the sheriff replied, his tone noticeably more deferential. "Not much to go on yet." "Perhaps not for a criminal case," Thornton agreed smoothly. "But more than enough for civil action if these incidents continue." He turned to Abigail. "I've drafted a cease and desist letter to be delivered to Harrington Developments this afternoon. It details the previous incidents and makes it clear that any further actions against either property will result in immediate legal proceedings." "You can't prove Harrington's behind this," the sheriff protested. "I don't have to, not yet," Thornton replied. "The letter simply puts them on notice that we're documenting everything. It establishes a paper trail for future reference." He turned back to Abigail. "I've also arranged for security personnel to patrol both properties at night, effective immediately. Former law enforcement officers, well-trained and equipped with cameras." Relief washed over Abigail. "Thank you, Michael. Just doing my job." He offered a small smile. Margaret would have expected nothing less. Sheriff Carlton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, I'll file this report and let you know if anything comes of it. Good day, Ms. Wilson, Michael." With a tip of his hat, he retreated to his cruiser. Once the sheriff had driven away, Thornton's expression turned grave. "This is escalating faster than I expected. Richard must be getting desperate. Or confident," Abigail suggested. "He told me at the dinner party that the county runs on practical realities and that the Harrington name carries weight everywhere. Maybe he believes he can pressure me with impunity. No one acts with complete impunity, not even Richard Harrington." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "But we need to be strategic in our response. Direct confrontation without proper evidence would be counterproductive. So we document everything and wait for him to make a mistake?" "Exactly. And in the meantime, we make it clear that you're not intimidated." He gestured toward the fence. "Get this repaired today. Double the number of cattle in this pasture. Show strength, not fear." Abigail nodded, determination replacing her earlier anger. "I can do that." "Good." Thornton checked his watch. "I need to get back to the office to finalize that cease and desist letter. Will you be all right here?" "I will." Abigail managed a smile. "I grew up handling farm emergencies, remember? This isn't my first broken fence." After Thornton departed, Abigail worked alongside Tom and Maria to organize the fence repair. Additional ranch hands were called in. Materials were gathered, and by mid-afternoon, the fence was not only repaired but reinforced with stronger materials. It was nearly evening by the time Abigail returned to Sutton Ranch, exhausted but satisfied with the day's response to the sabotage. She was looking forward to a hot shower and a quiet dinner when Rachel met her at the door with yet another concerned expression. "What now?" Abigail asked, too tired for preamble. "You have a visitor," Rachel said. "He's been waiting for about 20 minutes. I put him in the study." "Who is it?" "Judge Harrington." Surprise jolted through Abigail's fatigue. "James is here? Did he say why?" "No, just that he needed to speak with you about an urgent matter." Rachel hesitated. "He seems upset." Abigail sighed. So much for a quiet evening. "I'll go see him. Could you bring some coffee to the study? I have a feeling I'm going to need it." James Harrington stood by the window when Abigail entered the study, his back to the door, tension evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and she was struck by the conflict visible on his face. A mixture of anger, regret, and something that looked almost like shame. "James," she greeted him cautiously, "this is unexpected." "I apologize for coming unannounced," he said formally, "but I felt this couldn't wait." "What couldn't wait?" He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This cease and desist letter delivered to my father this afternoon about incidents at the Wilson property." "Ah." Abigail moved further into the room, maintaining some distance between them. "You're here on your father's behalf, then?" "No." The word was sharp, definitive. "I'm here on my own behalf. I knew nothing about these incidents, Abigail. Nothing." The intensity of his denial caught her off guard. "I never said you did, but you believe my father is responsible." "The evidence points that way, yes." James ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "What evidence exactly? Because this letter is long on accusations and short on proof." "Someone cut the fence at my farm last night," Abigail said, her own anger returning. Expensive wire cutters were left at the scene. This is after my irrigation system was vandalized and sugar was poured in my tractor's gas tank. All of this started after I made it clear to your father that I wouldn't sell. Correlation isn't causation, James argued. Those incidents could have other explanations. Could have, but don't, Abigail countered. Your father told me there would be unnecessary difficulties if I didn't cooperate with established interests. Now those difficulties are materializing. My father talks a lot, James said dismissively. He makes threats he doesn't follow through on. It's negotiating tactics, not criminal conspiracy. You're defending him? Abigail asked incredulously. After all your talk about distancing yourself from his business practices? I'm not defending vandalism or sabotage, James replied, his voice rising slightly. I'm saying you need concrete evidence before you make accusations like this against anyone, including my father. So the Harrington name does need special protection, even from you. James's expression hardened. That's unfair. I would say the same about accusations against anyone without sufficient evidence. That's how the law works. The law, Abigail repeated, a bitter taste in her mouth. Of course, always the law, never the reality of power and influence in this county. What's that supposed to mean? It means that while you're fishing and baking muffins and playing the honorable judge separated from your family's business interests, your father is using every lever of influence he has to force me off my land. Abigail's voice shook with emotion. And when I try to defend myself, suddenly I'm the one in the wrong for not having enough evidence to satisfy legal requirements. James flinched, as if she'd struck him. That's not fair, isn't it? Abigail moved closer, anger propelling her forward. You stand there in your perfect moral isolation, pretending you're separate from the Harrington machine, while benefiting from everything it provides you. Tell me, James, how much of your comfortable life comes from the developments your father built on land acquired through tactics like these? His face paled. I've worked for everything I have. From a foundation of privilege and power, your family accumulated over generations, she countered. Do you think I would have lost the Wilson farm in your courtroom if my last name had been Harrington instead of Wilson? If I'd had your family's resources and connections? I ruled based on the law, not names or connections, he insisted, but doubt flickered in his eyes. The law you and people like you created, Abigail said quietly. The law that works beautifully for those who can afford to navigate it and crushes those who can't. They stood facing each other, the space between them charged with tension and unspoken feelings. In the silence, Rachel entered with a tray of coffee, took one look at their confrontation, and retreated quietly, closing the door behind her. James was the first to break the silence. I thought... He stopped, swallowed. These past few weeks, by the river, I thought we were finding common ground. So did I, Abigail admitted, some of her anger ebbing. But that doesn't change the reality of what's happening. Your father is trying to drive me off my land, and you're here defending him. I'm not defending his business practices, James said wearily. I'm asking for the same standard of evidence I would require in my courtroom before condemning anyone. This isn't your courtroom. No, it's real life, where reputations and relationships can be damaged by unfounded accusations. He looked at her directly, including ours. The word hung in the air between them. Ours. A relationship neither had acknowledged was developing, now threatened before it had truly begun. Abigail sighed, suddenly tired beyond measure. What do you want from me, James? Let me talk to my father, he said. Not as a judge or as his son, but as someone who... He hesitated. As someone who cares about what happens to you and your land. Give me a chance to resolve this without escalation. And if the incidents continue, then I'll help you gather the evidence you need for real legal action. His expression was earnest, almost pleading. I believe in justice, Abigail. Real justice, not just the kind that comes from having the right last name. Abigail wanted to believe him. wanted to trust the man she'd come to know by the river, not the judge who had dismissed her in court or the son of the man threatening her livelihood. 1 week, she said finally. Talk to your father. Do whatever you need to do. But if anything else happens to either property in that time, I'm proceeding with every legal remedy available to me, regardless of the Harrington name. Relief washed over his face. Thank you. I promise I'll do everything I can. Don't promise what you can't deliver, Abigail warned. Your father doesn't strike me as a man who takes direction well, even from his son. You'd be surprised, James said grimly, when properly motivated. He moved toward the door, then paused. Thursday morning? By the river? Abigail hesitated. Part of her wanted to maintain their fragile connection, but another part recognized the wisdom of distance until this situation resolved. Let's see what happens with your father first, she said finally. Disappointment flickered in his eyes, but he nodded. Fair enough. After he left, Abigail sank into one of the study's comfortable leather chairs, emotionally drained. Rachel reappeared with the coffee tray. I thought you might still want this, she said, setting it on the side table. Thank you. Abigail accepted a cup gratefully. Were you listening at the door? Of course not, Rachel replied with dignity. Then, after a pause, the vent system in this old house carries sound remarkably well, though. Despite everything, Abigail laughed. So you heard. Enough. Rachel sat in the chair opposite her. You like him? It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. I was starting to. And now? Now I don't know what to think. Abigail stared into her coffee. He's either exactly what he appears to be, an honorable man, caught between his principles and his family, or he's playing a much deeper game than I realized. For what it's worth, Rachel said thoughtfully, I've lived in Riverdale all my life. The judge has a reputation for integrity that even his critics acknowledge. If he says he'll try to stop his father, I believe he means it. Whether he can do it is another question entirely. True. Rachel studied her with concern. What will you do if he can't? Abigail's expression hardened with resolve. Exactly what Margaret Sutton would have done. Fight for every inch of this land with every resource at my disposal. And the judge? The question touched something tender and uncertain in Abigail's heart. What about James Harrington, the man she'd come to know by the river, whose complexity and contradictions had drawn her in despite her initial judgment? I don't know, she admitted softly. I honestly don't know. For 3 days, following James's visit, Sutton Ranch and the Wilson farm remained undisturbed. No cut fences, no vandalized equipment, no mysterious accidents. The security personnel Thornton had hired reported nothing suspicious, and Abigail began to hope that James's intervention with his father had been effective. Then, on the 4th morning, everything changed. Abigail was reviewing financial projections with Rachel when Maria called from the Wilson farm, her voice tight with controlled panic. You need to come right away, she said. The creek, it's all wrong. Wrong how? Abigail asked, already reaching for her keys. The water's discolored and there's a smell. All the fish are dead. 20 minutes later, Abigail stood on the bank of Wilson Creek, staring in horror at the scene before her. The normally clear water had turned a sickly grayish-brown color. Dead fish floated on the surface. Their white bellies turned skyward like ghosts in the murky water. The acrid smell of chemicals hung in the air. When did you notice this? She asked Maria. About an hour ago. One went to check the irrigation intake and found this. Maria gestured to the dead fish. We've already shut off all water to the crops and called the environmental agency. They're sending someone out. The cattle? We moved them to the east pasture. They haven't been drinking from the creek today, thank God. Abigail knelt by the water's edge, careful not to touch the contaminated liquid. This didn't just happen. The creek flows from north to south across the property. Whatever caused this came from upstream. From Riverdale Industrial Park, Tom Davis said grimly, joining them at the creek bank. He'd arrived just after Abigail, having been called by Maria as well. That's the only facility north of here that could produce this kind of chemical contamination. Riverdale Industrial Park, Abigail repeated, a cold certainty forming in her gut. Owned by Harrington Developments. Tom nodded. Been there for about 15 years. They've had environmental violations before, but nothing this blatant. Call Michael Thornton, Abigail instructed Maria. Tell him what's happened and that I need him to meet me at the industrial park immediately. As Maria stepped away to make the call, Abigail turned to Tom. I need you to document everything. Take water samples, photographs, video. Get statements from every worker who witnessed this. We need to build an airtight case. You think this is deliberate, Tom said. It wasn't a question. 4 days ago, James Harrington promised to rein in his father's attempts to pressure me off this land, Abigail said, her voice hard. Now my creek is poisoned with industrial chemicals. What do you think? Tom's weathered face showed rare emotion, a mixture of anger and respect. I think Margaret chose her heir well. 45 minutes later, Abigail stood at the security gate of Riverdale Industrial Park, Thornton beside her, facing a nervous security guard who clearly wasn't accustomed to confrontation. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't let you in without an appointment, the guard repeated. Company policy. Your company is currently dumping toxic chemicals into a creek that runs through my property, Abigail replied, her voice level but intense. That gives me all the appointment I need. I don't know anything about that, the guard protested. Then I suggest you call someone who does, Thornton interjected smoothly. Perhaps Mr. Richard Harrington himself would be interested to know that we're here with documented evidence of environmental violations that could result in federal charges. The mention of federal charges got the guard's attention. He picked up his phone and made a hurried call, speaking too quietly for them to hear. After a moment, he hung up and opened the gate. Mr. Peterson, the facility manager, will meet you at the main office, he said, pointing to a building about 50 yards inside the complex. The facility manager turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his 40s, who seemed genuinely distressed by their accusations. We've had no unusual discharges today, he insisted, showing them the facility's monitoring systems. All our containment measures are functioning normally. Then how do you explain this? Abigail showed him photographs of the contaminated creek on her phone. Peterson's face paled. I can't. But it's not coming from our regular systems. We have safeguards, monitoring, redundant containment. Show us your retention ponds, Thornton demanded. The retention ponds were large, lined basins where treated wastewater was held before being safely released into the municipal system. As they approached the farthest pond, Abigail immediately spotted the problem. A large pipe had been positioned to drain directly from the pond into the surrounding soil, bypassing all monitoring systems. What is that? She asked Peterson, pointing to the pipe. The manager looked genuinely shocked. That shouldn't be there. That's not part of our approved system. It appears someone has created an unauthorized discharge point, Thornton observed, taking photographs with his phone. One that conveniently drains toward Wilson Creek. I didn't authorize this, Peterson insisted, looking increasingly panicked. I had no idea. Then who did? Abigail demanded. Before Peterson could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside them. Richard Harrington stepped out, his expression a mask of concern that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Wilson, Mr. Thornton, he greeted them with false cordiality. Security informed me we had a situation, something about water quality concerns. Your facility is dumping untreated chemicals directly into Wilson Creek, Abigail said, cutting through the pretense. We have evidence, and the Environmental Protection Agency is already on site at my property, documenting the damage. Richard's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Wilson. If there's contamination in the creek, I assure you it's not coming from our facility, at least not intentionally. Perhaps a regrettable accident or equipment failure. Like this, Thornton gestured to the unauthorized pipe. This doesn't look like an accident, Richard. It looks like deliberate environmental sabotage. I'm sure there's an explanation, Richard said smoothly. Peterson, have maintenance remove that immediately and investigate how it got there. Yes, sir, Peterson stammered, already reaching for his radio. And of course, Harrington Developments will cover any cleanup costs associated with this unfortunate incident, Richard continued, his tone reasonable and conciliatory. We take our environmental responsibilities very seriously. This goes beyond cleanup costs, Abigail said coldly. This is criminal environmental violation, property damage, and attempted economic sabotage. The creek provides irrigation water for half the Wilson farm crops. Without it, those crops die, making the property considerably less valuable, Thornton added pointedly. How convenient for anyone interested in purchasing it at a discount. Richard's facade of concern hardened into something more calculating. You should be careful about making accusations without proof, Ms. Wilson, especially against someone with Harrington Development's resources and legal team. I have all the proof I need, Abigail replied, holding up her phone. And unlike your son, I don't need a courtroom standard of evidence to know exactly what you're doing. At the mention of his son, Richard's expression changed, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his features. James has nothing to do with this. He promised me he would stop your campaign of harassment, Abigail said. Clearly he failed. Or perhaps he was never sincere in the first place, Richard suggested, watching her closely. The Harrington men are known for doing whatever it takes to achieve their goals. The implication was clear, and it struck at Abigail's deepest uncertainty about James. Had his friendship been genuine, or merely another tactic in the Harrington playbook? We're done here, she said, turning away from Richard. The environmental agency and my legal team will handle this from now on. Ms. Wilson, Richard called after her, this situation could become quite costly and time-consuming for everyone involved. Perhaps we should discuss a more mutually beneficial resolution. Abigail turned back, her expression hard. You want to make an offer on my land? Fine, $1 billion, cash, not a penny less. Richard laughed, though there was no humor in it. Be reasonable. That is reasonable. It's what the land is worth to me. Abigail stared him down. You keep trying to put a price tag on my family's heritage. Well, there it is. Either pay it or stop wasting my time with these tactics. Without waiting for his response, she walked back to her truck, Thornton following closely behind. That was direct, he observed as they drove away. Too direct, Abigail asked, suddenly uncertain. Did I just make things worse? Thornton considered this. Richard Harrington respects strength, even as he tries to crush it. You've shown him you won't be intimidated, which is good. But yes, he'll likely escalate. I'm ready for that, Abigail said grimly. What I'm not ready for is wondering about James's role in all this. The judge? Thornton glanced at her with sudden understanding. Ah, I'd heard rumors about your morning meetings. Riverdale really is a small town, Abigail sighed. James promised to intervene with his father. Either he tried and failed, or he never intended to try, Thornton finished. For what it's worth, I've known James Harrington professionally for many years. He's not his father, but he is a Harrington, Abigail said softly. That seems to mean something in this county. As they returned to the Wilson farm, the environmental agency representatives were already at work, taking samples and documenting the damage. The prognosis was grim. The creek would require extensive remediation, and the contaminated soil would need to be removed and replaced. Crops that had been irrigated with the tainted water might be lost. Abigail threw herself into crisis management, coordinating with experts, instructing workers, and planning emergency measures to save what crops they could. It was late evening by the time she finally returned to Sutton Ranch, exhausted and heartsick. Rachel met her at the door with news that didn't improve her mood. Judge Harrington called 3 times. He wants to see you. I'm sure he does, Abigail said bitterly. Did he leave a message? Just that it's urgent and he needs to explain. There's nothing to explain. Abigail headed for the stairs, too tired for anything but sleep. His father poisoned my creek after James promised to control him. Either he lied to me, or he's powerless against his father. Either way, I have nothing to say to him." "He seemed genuinely upset," Rachel persisted, "and he mentioned something about evidence." That made Abigail pause. "What evidence?" "He wouldn't say over the phone, just that he had information about the industrial park incident that you needed to hear in person." Abigail wavered, torn between her sense of betrayal and her need for answers. "Fine. Tell him I'll meet him tomorrow morning, the usual spot by the river." The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect spring day that usually lifted Abigail's spirits. Today, however, her mood matched the murky waters of Wilson Creek as she rowed Monarch along the riverbank toward her meeting with James. She spotted him before he saw her, standing by the water, not fishing today, but pacing restlessly, checking his watch. When he finally noticed her approach, the relief on his face was palpable. "Thank you for coming," he said as she dismounted. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Abigail replied, keeping her distance. "Your father poisoned my creek, James, after you promised to stop him." "I know," he said, his expression grim. "And I'm here to give you this." He handed her a thumb drive. "What's this?" "Security camera footage from Riverdale Industrial Park, internal emails, work orders for that pipe installation." James met her gaze directly. "Everything you need to prove my father's responsibility beyond any doubt, in court or in the court of public opinion." Abigail stared at the small device in her hand. "How did you get this?" "I still have access to company systems," he said. "Emergency protocols my father never bothered to update when I stepped away from the business." "You're giving me evidence against your own father," Abigail said, trying to process what this meant. "I'm giving you evidence for the truth." James ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she'd come to recognize. "I confronted him, Abigail, the night I came to see you. I told him to back off, to find another location for his development, to leave you alone. And he ignored you. Worse." He laughed. James's jaw tightened at the memory. "Said I was going soft over a pretty face, that I'd thank him later when this was all sorted out." The bitterness in his voice seemed genuine, but Abigail remained cautious. "Why should I believe you're not part of his plan? This could be an elaborate setup." "Because I've recused myself from any case involving you or your properties," James said quietly. "Filed the paperwork yesterday, and because I've initiated an ethics investigation into my own prior ruling on your foreclosure case, citing potential conflict of interest due to my father's development plans." That got Abigail's attention. "You what?" "It probably won't change the outcome. The bank did have legal grounds for foreclosure, but it puts everything on record." He stepped closer, his expression intense. "I'm choosing sides, Abigail. For the first time in my life, I'm openly opposing my father's methods. That thumb drive proves it." Abigail studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. She found only determination and what looked like genuine pain. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why risk your relationship with your father, your reputation?" "Because some things matter more," he said. "The truth matters. Justice matters." He hesitated, then added softly, "You matter." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. "I don't know what to say," Abigail admitted. "You don't have to say anything." James gestured to the thumb drive. "Just use that to stop him. My father respects only one thing, power. Show him you have it." Abigail nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what James had done. "This could damage your career." "Only if I cared about advancing to higher courts," he said with a hint of a smile. "Which it turns out I don't. Not if it means compromising what I believe in." "And what do you believe in, James Harrington?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious now. "That power shouldn't determine justice. That land is more than a commodity to be bought and sold. That some traditions and legacies deserve protection." His eyes held hers. "That connections between people can be unexpected and worth fighting for." Abigail felt something shift inside her. the hard shell of suspicion cracking to reveal a tender hope she'd been protecting. Even connections between a Harrington and a Wilson, especially those, he said softly. The most unlikely ones often prove the strongest. Before she could respond, her phone rang, Michael Thornton's number flashing on the screen. With an apologetic glance at James, she answered. "Abigail," Thornton said without preamble, "you need to get to the Wilson farm immediately. There's been a development." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through her. What kind of development? "Richard Harrington is here, with bulldozers." Abigail raced toward the Wilson farm, James following in his own vehicle. As they crested the final hill, the scene below stopped her heart. 3 massive bulldozers were positioned at the edge of her property, engines running. Richard Harrington stood nearby, surrounded by men in hard hats, gesturing toward the farmhouse like a general planning battle strategy. Thornton's car was parked haphazardly near the house, and he stood facing Richard, clearly in heated argument. Sheriff Carlton was also present, looking uncomfortable as he stood between the 2 men. "What the hell is he doing?" Abigail muttered as she parked and jumped out. "Making his final move," James replied grimly, joining her. "When my father feels cornered, he always goes big." They approached the confrontation, catching Richard mid-sentence. "Easement rights that clearly give us access through this property. The documents are over 50 years old, but still legally binding." "Those easement rights are for utility access only," Thornton countered, "not construction equipment or development activity." Richard spotted Abigail and James approaching together, his eyes narrowing at the sight. "Ms. Wilson, perfect timing. I was just explaining to your attorney that Harrington Developments holds historic easement rights through this property to access the river frontage." "You have no right to bring heavy equipment onto my land," Abigail said. "Sheriff, this is trespassing." Sheriff Carlton cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Harrington has produced documentation of an easement, ma'am. I'm not qualified to judge its legal validity, but on its face, it's an obvious attempt at intimidation," James interrupted, stepping forward. "Sheriff, these men are trespassing until a court determines the scope and validity of any alleged easement." The sheriff looked startled to find himself contradicted by the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not speaking as a judge right now," James clarified, "but I know enough about property law to recognize that disputed easements don't give anyone the right to bring bulldozers onto private property without court approval." Richard's expression hardened as he faced his son. "This is disappointing, James. I expected better loyalty from you." "My loyalty is to the law, not to business tactics that skirt it," James replied evenly. Richard snorted. "Since when? The Harrington fortune that paid for your education and launched your career wasn't built on legal niceties. It was built on seeing opportunities and taking decisive action." "Is that what you call poisoning my creek?" Abigail demanded. "Decisive action?" Richard's face revealed nothing. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Then perhaps you should see this." Abigail held up the thumb drive James had given her. "Security footage, emails, work orders, everything documenting your direct instructions to install an illegal drainage pipe at the industrial park, the pipe that contaminated Wilson Creek with toxic chemicals." For the first time, Richard looked genuinely unsettled. His eyes darted to James. "Where did you get that?" "From someone with access and a conscience," Abigail replied, deliberately vague. "The Environmental Protection Agency already has copies, as does the State Attorney General's office." This was a bluff. She hadn't had time to share the evidence yet. But Richard couldn't know that. His facade cracked slightly, uncertainty showing through. "You're bluffing," he said, but without conviction. "Try me." Abigail gestured to the bulldozers. "But first, get these machines and your men off my property. Now." Richard hesitated, clearly calculating his options. "This isn't over, Ms. Wilson." "Actually, it is," James said, stepping forward. "The Wilson farm isn't the only property with historic documentation worth examining." He pulled a folder from his jacket and handed it to Thornton. These papers from the county archives show that when Sutton Ranch and the Wilson property were originally one parcel, split between two brothers in 1892, the division included specific covenants that neither property could ever be developed for non-agricultural purposes without unanimous consent from all living descendants of both brothers. Thornton scanned the documents, his eyebrows rising. These appear authentic and legally binding. Property covenants of this nature run with the land indefinitely unless formally dissolved, which they never were, James confirmed. I found these yesterday while researching the alleged easements my father is claiming. Richard snatched the papers from Thornton, his face darkening as he read. This is absurd. These covenants are over a century old. No court would enforce them. I wouldn't be so sure, Thornton replied. Courts have consistently upheld historic covenants when they're clearly documented and haven't been abandoned through disuse. These appear to meet both criteria. You knew about this? Richard accused his son, anger replacing calculation. You've been working against me this whole time. I've been working for what's right, James corrected. Something you taught me when I was young, before profit margins became your only moral compass. The personal rebuke seemed to hit Richard harder than the legal threats. For a moment, father and son stared at each other across a divide far wider than the few feet separating them. Finally, Richard turned to the construction foreman. Pack it up. We're leaving. To Abigail, he added, this isn't finished. I have an army of lawyers who will find holes in these ancient documents. And I have the truth about your environmental crimes, Abigail countered. Which would you rather have made public first? It was a standoff, Richard's development ambitions against Abigail's evidence of his illegal actions. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Sheriff Carlton, who had been watching the exchange with increasing discomfort, cleared his throat. Mr. Harrington, I'm going to have to ask you and your men to leave this property now. Until these legal matters are settled in court, this looks like trespassing to me. Richard's jaw tightened, but he recognized defeat, at least for the moment. With a curt nod to his men, he stalked back to his SUV without another word. The bulldozers began backing away from the property line. As the Harrington Developments crew departed, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the Wilson farm workers who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Abigail felt a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. You did it, Thornton said, squeezing her shoulder. Margaret would be proud. We did it, Abigail corrected, glancing at James. All of us. Later, as the sun began to set over Sutton Ranch, Abigail and James sat on the front porch swing, watching the golden light transform the landscape into something magical. After the confrontation, they'd spent hours with Thornton, planning their legal strategy should Richard attempt to challenge the property covenants or easement rights. Now, finally, they had a moment of peace. Will this damage your relationship with your father permanently? Abigail asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind. James considered this. Probably not permanently. My father respects strength and strategy, even when it's used against him. Once his anger cools, he'll recognize that I outmaneuvered him using skills he himself taught me. That's oddly functional, in a dysfunctional way. James laughed. That's the Harringtons in a nutshell. His expression grew more serious. The bigger question is what happens with us. Us? Abigail repeated softly. These past weeks, by the river, I've come to care for you, Abigail, more than I expected. He turned to face her directly. But I understand if my last name is a complication you'd rather avoid. Abigail considered all that had happened, from their contentious beginning in his courtroom to this moment of quiet connection. You know, Margaret Sutton spent her entire life holding a grudge against my grandmother because of a man. She missed out on family, on connection, on love, all because of a name and a past she couldn't let go of. She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. I don't want to make that same mistake. So the Harrington name isn't a deal breaker? Hope warmed his voice. The name? No. Abigail smiled. But the man carrying it better be worthy of it. He better stand for something real, something true. Like protecting family land from development, James suggested with a smile. That's a good start. She leaned closer. I think Margaret and my grandmother would both approve, in their own ways. A Wilson and a Harrington, James mused. Riverdale won't know what hit it. Good, Abigail said, closing the distance between them. It's about time this town got shaken up a little. As their lips met, the last rays of sunset bathed Sutton Ranch in golden light, illuminating not just the land that had brought them together, but the future they might build upon it. 6 months later, Abigail stood at the edge of Wilson Creek, watching clear water flow once again over smooth stones. The environmental remediation had been successful, funded entirely by Harrington Developments, as part of a settlement that included a public apology and Richard's resignation from the company's board. James approached, carrying a basket. Picnic by the creek. I brought those strawberries from the new patch. The Wilson farm had been revitalized, with new, sustainable farming practices that had made it profitable for the first time in years. Sutton Ranch continued to thrive under Abigail's management, with Tom Davis's steady guidance and Rachel's administrative skills, and Richard Harrington. After the initial confrontation, he'd retreated to Florida for several months of reflection, returning with a surprising proposal. A conservation easement that would permanently protect both the Wilson farm and Sutton Ranch from future development, in exchange for Abigail dropping potential criminal charges related to the environmental violations. Your father's conservation proposal, you think he's sincere? Abigail asked, as they spread the picnic blanket beneath an old oak tree. In his way, James replied. He recognized a superior strategy and is making the best of it. Plus, I think nearly losing his relationship with me affected him more than he expected. Their relationship had progressed steadily, navigating the complexities of their history and the small-town gossip, with humor and patience. James had remained on the county bench, earning new respect for his principled stand against his father's tactics. The small-town heiress and the honorable judge, Abigail mused, accepting a strawberry from the basket. Not quite the enemies we started as. I prefer to think of us as partners, James said, reaching for her hand. In preservation, in justice, in love, Abigail suggested, her heart full. His smile was answer enough as they sat together by the creek that had nearly divided them, but now flowed clean and strong, much like the bond they had forged against all odds.